So your CIO came to you recently and said they need a new chief title in IT. Maybe it was a chief AI officer, a chief data officer, deputy CIO. You approved it because IT is complex, right? You trusted the recommendation. But here's what nobody told you. An org chart is not an administrative diagram. It's a capital deployment system. Every chief title you approve in IT without attaching fiduciary accountability changes how capital moves through your company. And it changes how fast capital stops moving entirely. If you're a genuine chief in a company, you should be listed as an officer, not a title, an actual officer of the company, because once you're an officer, you carry fiduciary responsibility. You're personally accountable for how capital is spent and how it is reported. You cannot claim ignorance, and there's no committee to hide behind. And I learned that when I was 30 years old. And I was lucky enough to become CIO of a publicly traded NASDAQ company. And 3 months in, Sarbanes-Oxley passed. And I had to help build the entire compliance program. What I understood immediately was that an officer of that company, I was personally exposed if costs were not controlled and financials were not reported correctly. That forced me to look at every financial statement, every month. It forced me to go back to the CFO and ask questions I had never thought to ask before. And it was one of the greatest lessons of my career. And I carried it through everything I did after. When you hand someone a chief title without officer status, you get a title with none of the accountability. And that's not a small distinction. That is the entire accountability structure gone. Look at how your company is structured outside of IT. The CEO has CXOs reporting to them. The CFO, COO, CHRO, etc. Each of these leaders have VPs or directors reporting to them. That's the structure everywhere in a company. But somehow, IT accumulated an entirely separate tier of chief titles that exists nowhere else in your organizational structure. And every time a new technology category emerged, a new chief title appeared to go with it. Nobody questioned it because it was IT. It must be complex enough to all of that needs leadership. And that assumption is exactly what your CIO is counting on every time they bring you a new title request. So let me now go through some of these titles, because I think boards and executives are being told these roles are necessary when most of them, quite frankly, are not. The CIO, yes, very necessary, but only if they're an actual officer of the company with fiduciary responsibility for the budget they manage. The CIO, who is not an officer of the company, is not going to get a seat at the table, nor do they deserve it. They're going to be the person you call when the projector stops working. And that's not my opinion. That's the structural reality of what the title means without the accountability. CTO is also necessary. The CTO owns the technical architecture and the engineering direction. Now, the CIO and the CTO work with the business units to identify where the pain points are and what technology can solve them. And those are two different jobs, but they complement each other when the structure is clean. Both should be officers. Both should have fiduciary consequence. The CISO. This is one where I will lose some people. But in my opinion, it's really not a necessary chief title. Security is an operational function. Security's job is to protect the company's data, period. That's it. And what I've seen CISOs do in practice is show up to decisions and say that they're not sure the solution adheres to our standards, and then block the decision. And sometimes they're saying this about platforms like Salesforce or Office 365 or these big other SaaS platforms whose security is far beyond anything that you could probably do in your own company. But they need to, quite frankly, justify themselves sometimes. So they throw up these roadblocks. A VP or director of security with the right team underneath them will produce the same results or better at a fraction of the cost. And I've just not seen the evidence that that chief title adds proportional value. Then there's the chief data officer. Now, I've never worked for a company that actually had good data governance, data quality, or a real data strategy. Data is always disparate. It's all over the place. There's no cohesion to it. And I've worked at companies that spent large amounts of money on this role. The title exists. The outcomes do not follow. A director or VP level focused on data operations will deliver more than a chief title. The chief enterprise architect. That's the CTO's job. If your CTO cannot own the technical blueprint of the organization, quite frankly, you just have the wrong CTO. The chief innovation officer. I've never understood what this role produces. Innovation is supposed to be embedded in every leadership function. When you create a chief title for it, you've effectively told the rest of the organization that innovation is someone else's responsibility. That's the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. And then there's the new one, the chief AI officer, which is probably the most expensive example of a solution looking for a problem that I've ever seen in my career. Because think about for a moment what you're actually doing when you create this role. You're hiring someone at a very high salary and a bonus whose primary job is to go find AI solutions to spend money on. You're paying someone to generate capital requests for technology your organization may not be ready for or might not even need. And that will arrive without a defensible return standard attached. The AI strategy belongs to the CIO working with the business. Creating a separate chief title for it does not produce a better AI strategy. It produces a larger budget, but more diffused accountability for the outcome. And that's one of the reasons why they like all of these different titles. It diffuses the authority. It diffuses the responsibility. It refuses the accountability for the CIO. Okay, there's other people who can be looked at if something isn't working. Now, you already know this is expensive, but let me just put a number on what your instinct is already telling you. So you have a CIO and a CTO, $200,000 each a year plus bonuses. That's roughly $500,000 in annual compensation. Now add 5 or 6 chief titles underneath them, and you're past $1 million in salary and benefits. In my experience, those additional titles produce no material outcome that a VP or director level function would have produced at a third of the price. But the salary is not even the real number. The real number is what late capital deployment cost you. What is the fully loaded cost of a single approval cycle when it moves through 9 people instead of 2? Which financial variable moves when your approval velocity doubles? And what is the margin impact over the next 4 quarters exactly as it is? So let me give you an example now of 2 different org charts. I've lived inside these personally. This is companies that I've worked for and what I've been in. And I want to talk about them because the contrast between them makes this argument better than any theory does. So company 1 is an $8 billion in revenue, spanning 30 countries, the entire United States, 30,000 employees worldwide. IT leadership was 2 people. The CIO and me as the global CTO. Everyone else was a VP or a director. When we or the business identified a problem, we agreed, we moved, and we executed. Large projects that would have taken organizations years took us months. Cost was controlled tightly because 2 people owned every decision, and both of us were officers of the company with personal consequence for the outcome. Now take company 2, $2.5 billion in revenue, 2,500 employees spanning 1 state. And this was their structure. 1 CIO, 1 deputy CIO, 5 CTOs, 4 additional chiefs underneath those CTOs. What happened there was not leadership failure. It was a structural inevitability. Every capital decision moved through peer negotiation. Every project required consensus from 9 or 10 people who all had opinions, and none of them who carried personal fiduciary consequence for the outcome. Projects that should have taken weeks took months. Some took years just to get off the ground, and forget completing them. One project ran so long, the vendor went out of business before deployment. The capital was spent, the solution was purchased, the company got nothing back. Now, the board and management approved that structure that made that outcome inevitable. And I call this authority migration. Authority migration is the structural shift that occurs when capital decisions move through negotiation rather than ownership, and no single executive carries accountability for the outcome. In Company 2, authority migration was complete before the board even recognized it, and the CFO filled the accountability vacuum. Finance always fills the gap that operation leaves open. When the CFO starts making technology decisions that belong to IT leadership, it's not because the CFO overreached. It's because the structure your board approved created a vacuum, and the capital had to go somewhere. Look at your IT org chart today. Count the chief titles. Then ask a different questions than one you may normally ask. Not whether the titles look reasonable, not whether the people are competent. Ask whether any of them are officers of the company with personal fiduciary consequence for the capital they approve. You do not have an IT leadership structure. You have a negotiation committee with a budget, and the next capital exposure that structure produces will land on your desk, not theirs.